citizens of this great country are passing laws all the time to take away our freedoms. Why don't they pass laws stating that every penny spent should be accounted for and posted on the internet?
Or all their documents posted on the internet, or that the Freedom of Information Act applies to the Smithsonian Institution.
Next call, Missoula, Montana. You're on the air.
Hi, Mr. Grimaldi. I'd just like to ask you a question about the Vice President and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Why are they on this board other than their name recognition? What exactly is their contribution to the board, if you can tell me?
Well, the Chancellor, they're both non-voting members. The Chancellor, the Chief Justice, has presided over the meetings. He, I believe, has participated in certain ways but does not vote. I think that the Vice President may be less involved than the Chief Justice is. And I think that essentially they're a creation or a throwback to a previous time. However, there's a suggestion about, well, is the real reason that people want to be on this board that they get to have a moment at a dinner at a Regents meeting where they get to brush shoulders with the Vice President and the Chief Justice of the United States? And is that the reason that they're able to bring these big names to the Board of Regents who may be rainmakers and or fundraisers and or donors? So there's a question about really what is the role and what is happening at that Board of Regents, and I think your question has hit upon it.
15 minutes to go with our guest. House comes in for a brief time. Here's a, just for a pro forma session, Mr. Grimaldi, who hired Lawrence Small? Was the Bush administration involved in his appointment from James Murphy of New York City?
The question is, was the Bush administration involved?
Who hired him?
No. And in fact, I've gotten that question quite a bit. There's some presumption that he was hired actually during the Clinton administration. He was not hired, but that was irrelevant. The Clinton administration or the Bush administration had nothing to do with it. They were hired by, there was a three-member board, three regents that were set up to sort of look for a new secretary. Howard Baker and two others. Senator Howard Baker was on that committee at the time, and they did some interviews, and they were the ones who made the selection.
Let me just for a second, before we take another call, give a side of this story that we haven't heard this morning. Mr. Small was hired because he knows how to raise money.
Right, he's raised a lot of money.
I'm just saying that if somebody were defending him,
yes,
that Mr. Small was paid almost $1 million a year, but he ran a billion-dollar institution. Mr. Small personally was responsible for raising $1 billion over the 7 years that he was there. That if you're going to have a private-public partnership like this, you've got to have people involved who know what they're doing, and that's why they hire somebody like Larry Small to do this job, who came out of industry, was with Citicorp for a number of years, the largest banking institution for 27 years. What would you say to that?
Well, let me build on that, because there's some other arguments that we haven't made on behalf of the Board of Regents, which is they said they were trying to raise his salary up to the 50th percentile of universities and certain nonprofits. The question is, you know, is there inflation even in nonprofits? I mean, the head of the Getty Institution, the Getty Museum out in Los Angeles, was recently forced to resign for similar things. There's also a question about propriety in terms about, you know, spending this kind of money on his house and his office at a time where there's a building right next door to the castle that has a roof that's in risk of collapse, that's also on the National Register of Historic Buildings. There's a question about this business enterprise that he set up that was supposed to make more money, which in actual dollars adjusted for inflation made less money. There's also a question about, and Senator Grassley has said this, also in which, you know, it's the Smithsonian Institution. How hard is it to raise money for the Smithsonian Institution? It's God, motherhood, and apple pie.
Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, on the Democratic line. You're on.
Mr. Grimaldi, a couple of questions for you. I'm sure through your investigation you must be very familiar with the finances of the Smithsonian. First question is, are all the museums and components of the Smithsonian located in Washington?
No.
And what others are there? I understand there's supposed to be one being constructed in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania shortly, some sort of industrial historic museum, along with many other new business ventures going in here on the, the brownfields for the former steel company.
Thanks, caller. Let me just show the audience off the Smithsonian website, and you can talk about it as we do, the museums that are under their responsibility. The Anacostia Community Museum, it's in Anacostia, D.C., right across the bridge. Arts and Industries Building, is that the castle?
No, the Arts and Industries Building is the building I've been referring to, the one that's in danger of complete collapse.
Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum.
New York City.
Freer Gallery of Art and Arthur M. Sackler Gallery.
That's here on the Mall.
Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden.
Also on the Mall.
National Air and Space Museum.
Of course, on the Mall.
Then, there's no picture here, but the Stephen F. Udvar Hazy Center.
That's out by Dulles Airport. That's the new annex for the Air and Space Museum, which I've been to a couple of times. Every time I have a relative in town, we go out there, and it's quite a great facility.
National Museum of African Art.
On the Mall.
National Museum of American History, the Bering Center.
Right, that's the one that's closed now for renovation. Certain of the artifacts there, including the Lincoln Top Hat, are available for display in a gallery at the Air and Space Museum.
Let's go back to it in a moment. Salisbury, North Carolina, Republican, you're on the air.
Yeah, Mr. Grimaldi.
Yes, sir.
By patriot being the extreme patriotic being, I don't particularly like your newspaper, and I don't read it. But
well, maybe if you did, you would.
Pardon, let me finish, sir. I've had a hard time getting in here. You can answer my question when I finish the next one. Other question, I don't particularly care for you, but that's beside the point.
Well, I'm sorry.
Wait a minute, let me finish.
Caller, let me just ask you this. Why is it necessary for you to make a personal comment like that?
Because I want to ask the question. It's not personal.
It's not necessary.
But I've listened to him, sir.
I'm going to move on because there's just too much of this going on. Let's go to Detroit, Michigan. You're on the air.
Good morning. I'd like to thank Mr. Grimaldi for his efforts in exposing this corruption. And I'd like to make a comment that as far as Freedom of Information Act requests go, that any area that our government funds, they're naturally all done with our taxpayer dollars. They should be certainly open to any kind of questions about the salaries that are just this exorbitant rate that we see this gentleman earning. And like I said, again, I'd like to thank Mr. Grimaldi for his efforts, and they're certainly appreciated. Thank you very much.
Well, I thank you. I appreciate that. And the only remedy I see for the FOIA problem is an act of Congress.
Meaning, you have to change it all?
The Congress could write a law saying that the Freedom of Information Act applies to the Smithsonian.
Does Congress set this FOIA up so that we can get anything you want out of the administration, but you can get nothing out of the Congress?
Right.
So in other words, there's no Freedom of Information request
well,
to go into
yes. I mean, now the Congress would say there are certain reporting requirements that are available. For example, lobbying disclosure forms, financial disclosure forms. Many of these records we use to do that Susan Schmidt and I and R. Jeffrey Smith used to do the Abramoff series. So there are certain records that they, through their own agreement, have made open to the public.
Mansfield, Massachusetts. You're on the air for James Grimaldi.
Yes, hello. Brian, first I want to say that C-SPAN is a tremendous public service, and I only wish that more people had more time to view exactly how the government operates and in keeping everyone honest. And obviously, the Washington Post, just the personal slams aside, our democracy is based on debate, and that means that two positions have to be presented in order for you to have a debate. So you have to accept the good and the bad with every organization that reports the news. My specific question concerning the Smithsonian is already been asked and answered, and that was who appointed Mr. Small to run that organization. And I'd like to morph to a second point, and the second point is really probably more significant than that question. And that is, why doesn't the Inspector General for each agency answer to the committee within the Congress that controls oversight?
Well, answer your last question first. They do, and in fact, the Inspector General has had to answer questions under the Inspector General's Act to Congress, and Congress only recently has gotten more actively interested in the Smithsonian. I think I answered earlier that the Board of Regents appoints the Secretary of the Smithsonian. There was a question that's still unclear to me about the murky process about who appoints the regents, and there was a suggestion that there was a heavy hand involving the Secretary. In regarding the debate and two positions, there are many positions, and there's a separation between the editorial page of the Washington Post and the news pages of the Washington Post. But you have to read our editorial page. It's filled with diverse viewpoints. It's not just liberal or conservative. That's really an antiquated, backward, ignorant notion, frankly. We have Charles Krauthammer and George Will, who are two of the most conservative
Robert Novak.
and Robert Novak, who are three of the most conservative commentators in America today. The Washington Post, much to the chagrin of many liberals and people opposed to the war, advocated going to war in Iraq, for example. And I suspect that our friend from Salisbury, and I apologize, I didn't mean to get contentious there, would be surprised if he would go to WashingtonPost.com and read a real diversity of opinion and a marketplace of ideas on our editorial pages.
You didn't get contentious, I did. As a matter of fact, and the reason I did was people who are anonymous and sit out there and watch this program call up and attack these guests that we have on here, and they never have to be accountable for it. And it's been, we've done this for a long time, and it just seems to get worse and worse.
It's your show.
Yeah, I know. Bradenton, Florida, you're on the air. Please go ahead.
Hi. I'm calling also from Waterford. I live both places. I want to know, how long have the Democrats been on this Regents? Did they come in with the election? And how often do the Regents meet? And are the Democrats voting members?
Thanks.
Yes, the Democrats and the Republicans are voting members. I need to look at, if you gave me the list, I could count up the Democrats and Republicans. There's 6. I think they try to have a balance.
There are 4 Democrats and 2 Republicans.
2 Republicans now, yeah. And that probably reflects the recent change in the control of the Congress, because I think before it might have been 4 Republicans and 2 Democrats.
And of course, the rest of them who are members could be Republicans and Democrats also. I mean, they're
right.
Not senators.
They're a mix, and I will point out, because people have asked, Larry Small is registered non-party.
Let me ask you this question from somebody who calls themselves Unitron, and I wonder if they call themselves Unitron. Hi, I'm Unitron. When was the last time a Smithsonian director who is also a member of Congress voted against any funding for the Smithsonian?
Say that voted against any funding?
When was the last time a Smithsonian director who is also a member of Congress voted against any funding for the Smithsonian?
Yeah, I guess they probably mean Smithsonian Regent. Never, as far as I know, but actually I really don't know the answer to that question. I would suspect that the funding comes out of the Interior Appropriations Bill, and I suspect many people would have voted, there would be a split vote sometimes on any appropriations bill. I'd have to go back and research that, but I suspect that they vote yes every time.
Naperville, Illinois, you're on the air, Republican.
Good morning. Earlier this morning, one of you mentioned that Vice President Cheney, when asked about this fiasco, responded by saying that he had a busy day job.
No, that was the Vice President.
Vice President, I beg your pardon. Having made that a response, doesn't he have an obligation to resign? Isn't he saying he's too busy to do that function, and should he not be responsible to resign?
Well, I think that's being examined by the Senate Finance Committee, and there's also a separate governance committee that's been created by the Board of Regents to evaluate this throwback to the 1800s, this creation, in terms of why. And I've had one congressional staffer say to me, and the letter was to Senator Grassley's office, I had one staffer say to me, this reads to me like a plea for help from Vice President Cheney.